Fascinating revelations from the COVID inquiry today. It's having a bit of a blockbuster week. The man still in charge of the entire civil service, Simon Case, said that during the pandemic, Boris Johnson, quotes, changes strategic direction every day. He cannot lead, and we cannot support him in leading with this approach. Government isn't actually that hard, but this guy is really making it impossible. Well, today's hearing focused on Johnson's principal private secretary. You might remember him for his nickname, so-called Party Marty, and for sending the infamous "Bring Your Own Booze" email, which he also reflected on.
I think I would first like to say how deeply sorry I am for my part in those events and for the email message which went out that day. And I'd like to apologise unreservedly to the families of all those who suffered during COVID for all the distress caused.
Well, joining me now is political correspondent of the Spectator, James Heale, to dice over the day. Stories of unbelievable dysfunction at the top of Downing Street, James, during the pandemic. Can you believe it? Look, a big day here. What was your takeaway?
Well, Rosanna, I think it confirmed what we already knew, really, which is that number 10, rather than being this sort of well-oiled machine at the centre of government, was in fact a sort of nest of vipers with top advisors and politicians turning on each other, with indecision and instability at the heart of government. And really, I think it's confirmed all the worst fears from a lot of people within the Conservative Party and outside it about what was really going on at the top of decision-making during the pandemic. And it's revealed a portrait, really, which shows that the Boris Johnson regime was had flaws from the beginning of the pandemic. And really, it was covering the first 18 months or so of that. And it really hasn't been a good day for the government.
Yeah, it certainly hasn't, and they knew it was going to come. Look, one of the people concerned, Simon Case's predecessor, Mark Sedwell, saying if Mr Johnson wants to scapegoat him, he'll have to do it face-to-face. Pretty bold.
Yes, these are some of the WhatsApp messages from May 2020. At the time, Mark Sedwill was the cabinet secretary. They were seen as being someone who was obstructive to the kind of Dominic Cummings reform, the hard reign of Whitehall reform agenda, which he was putting on at that time. And really, you know, it shows that these civil servants, far from being these sort of great mandarins of Whitehall and Westminster, were in fact sort of squabbling among themselves and sort of talking about, oh, if he's going to fire me, he needs to do it face to face towards me. And really, I think that because Mark Sedwill was seen as a somewhat obstructive force throughout those early months, it therefore perhaps led to Simon Case, who some perhaps in Whitehall would see as a little more of a sort of placeman for the kind of Boris Johnson regime. So both cabinet secretaries, Mark Sedwill and Simon Case, I would say probably don't come out of today's evidence sessions particularly well.
Now, some of the infighting we're hearing about, people saying openly that they wouldn't carry out the orders of Prime Minister Boris Johnson at the time. Do you think this says more about the Johnson government or it does about the people's idea of how they thought lockdown should be carried out?
I think really it all comes back to the Prime Minister. We have a system of government in this country where it really is all about who the PM wants in office, etc. And so I think that what Boris Johnson had in government, I think this really validates the accounts of, you know, respected historians like people like Anthony Seldon, for instance, that he ran it as a bit of a court. And so there were various factions in the ascent or dissent, all competing for his ear. And I think that really the cabinet secretary and his messages are the ones that are most of interest because he's the only sort of live player left in this, Simon Case. Those messages point to the fact that he is frustrated and trying to implement what Boris Johnson wants because it varies by day to day. And the veering and the so-called shopping trolley that Dominic Cummings talked about suggests it was a really, really difficult time to govern. And those working with him felt those frustrations very keenly.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I always find this when you think on an international scale, all countries were dealing with this to a certain extent. It's just the way that the British government handled it at the time. It's been particularly colourful. I think some of the characters that are coming out during this inquiry are, of course, not the only country to be doing an inquiry. Some have already completed theirs. Look, we are expecting Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak to give evidence to the inquiry later on in this year. What will that look like, do you reckon?
Well, I reckon that it might be a bit like the Privileges Committee investigation that we saw earlier this year with Boris Johnson, whereby, you know, he will counter sort of details about the minutiae and the timescale with a great, you know, flurry of words and kind of fantastic evocative phrases, etc., to obstruct and defer the grease piglet of past. So I think there'll be about sort of dancing around. And I think what we saw today was Hugo Keith, who's the lead counsel for the COVID-19 inquiry, really getting a bit frustrated with some of the civil service language used by Martin Reynolds. What we'll see later later this year, I suspect, with Boris Johnson, is him trying to pin down a great politician's evasion. So I think it'll be a long session. And with Rishi Sunak, I think he actually comes out of the COVID inquiry better than most politicians. So I think that with him, it'll be much more about the pernickety detail, which Rishi Sunak seems more comfortable with than certainly Boris Johnson does.
Even with Eat Out to help out. Well, let's see. And would it be a conversation about government disharmony without mentioning a greased piglet? James Heale, Westminster correspondent for The Spectator. Thank you.